The goal of this tutorial is to have our game world show up on our map, or parts thereof. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start adding some comments. Now the way you add comments is you put 2 slashes. Now a comment's really useful. It's a human readable note that explains what's going on in the code. And they're necessary because it just makes things easier to work out where things are going wrong and explain it to others. So this is the setup function for the entire game. It runs once. And my function for draw, this function runs for every frame of the game, around 60 frames per second. Okay. Now we've only ever seen these particular functions that have come pre-packaged with P5.js, but there are actually others, and we need to use a couple of them, or one of them in particular. And this one's the preload function. Preload runs once before setup. So function preload. Now we'll use the preload function here to load up our tile map. That's the world.js file that contained all our images. So we're going to actually need to create a variable to hold that information. So variable var tiled map. And down here we're going to go tiled map equals load tiled map. Now when we load our tiled map, we need to give it the name that we gave it, which is world. And we need to say what folder it is, which is in images. Now if we refresh our game now, we don't see anything, but it did show that loading screen for a moment. Now we can see if there are any errors. If we hold down Control, Shift, and then I, it opens up this console, this sidebar. Now we're going to pretty much leave this open all the time when we're developing. And the reason we're going to do that is because if there's an error in our code, it will show up here. So let's give a demonstration of that. I'm just going to put an error in my code. I'm going to say X. And now I'll refresh. And now it's given me an error. It said uncaught reference error, X is not defined in, and it's told me where that is. It's told me it's in game.js in line 7. That's really useful information. So if I go to game.js and I look in line 7, there it is. That's that X that I put in that was undefined. So that was a trivial example of an error, but it's really useful for us so we can identify where things are going wrong. Okay, the next thing we need to do is we need to go down to setup. And we need to, in setup, we need to get hold of all of those layers that we created. So we created 5 layers in our world. We created the background, the foreground, the ground, the ladders, and the depth. Now before we create them, we need to generate a variable to hold that information. So we're going to go let, which is another way of creating variables, layer equal curly brackets, square brackets, sorry. Now what this does, it creates a list. This creates a list. Technically an array that will store all the layers that were in the map. And additionally, to having somewhere to store all that information, that raw data about the layers, we need to create something else as well to hold the visual information. So we're going to have the layer, which is going to control the technical information, and we're going to use that to detect if we're standing on things. And then we're actually going to have the images, which is what's going to be painted on the screen. So let layer images also equal a list, which is the square brackets. This list holds all the image or drawing information for the layers in the map. Cool. Now, in setup, we need to extract that information. So we're going to make the layer equal get tile map layers. And it's going to get those from the tiled map that we generated earlier. And then the layer images is going to equal get tile map images for that tile map also. Tiled. Got to spell it correctly. There's a D in there. Okay, so I'll add a comment here. These lines of code load up the layer and image data from the world map. So we should be good. So let's just test and see if we're getting any errors, and we refresh. Now, notice what's happened here. When we loaded those up, it's given us the names of those layers that we created in our tile map. And it's also given us numbers associated with those, 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. That's really useful information. We're going to need that information, in fact. So we're going to take this information, we're going to put it in our code. We're going to create 5 variables. One for the background layer, one for the ground, one for the ladders, and they're just going to store these numbers. And that's just going to make it easy for us to refer to later on, so we don't have to remember what number each layer is. So up here at the top, we're going to create the values of the different world layers. So we're going to go let background. Now I'm going to use capital letters here. Let background equal 0, because it was layer 0. And then I had ground, ladders, depth, and foreground. Let ground equal 1. Let ladders equal 2. Let depth equal 3. Let foreground equal 4. And I'll just check that. Background, ground, ladders, depth, and foreground. Background, ground, ladders, depth, and foreground. And all the numbers are correct. Cool. So that's going to make it really easy, because I don't have to remember what number background layer is. I just need to type in the word background now. That's my variable. It's going to hold that information for me. Okay, so refresh and it loads up, but we don't actually see those layers. We need to draw them. So when we draw them, we're going to do that in our draw function. So let's add a comment. This code draws the layers on the screen. So how do we do that? Well, we just go image, layer images. Remember that was a list. So put in the square brackets, and we're going to put in ground, because we want to draw the ground layer. And we want to draw that at position 0, 0. So I'll just space that out so it's a bit more readable. So this says, on the screen, draw an image. Let that be the image called ground, with the ground reference in layer images at 0, 0. And if I go up now and refresh, I can see some of my world has been drawn, my ground has been drawn. Now, the reason we can't see the rest of it is because I set my screen height to be 360 and my world is bigger than that. but that will be fixed soon enough. And now I'm just going to copy this. I'm going to draw my other layers. So I had, after my ground, I had my background, and then I had my ground, and after ground, there were ladders, and after ladders I had death, and after death I had foreground. Okay, background, ground, ladders, death, and foreground. Now, it will draw them in that order. So I'll draw my background, and on top of that it will draw the ground, on top of that it will draw the ladders, on top of that it will draw death, and on top it will draw foreground. And now if I refresh, all of my layers draw. So I drew my background, then my ground, and then my ladders, and I can't see my death or foreground at the moment. So there's my world, it now shows up, and that also brings us to the end of this tutorial.